Let's be real for a second. Keeping records isn't exactly the most glamorous part of ministry care, is it? But it's absolutely, undeniably one of the most vital. In this explainer, we're going to completely unpack how to ethically and accurately document biblical counseling under the Restoring Hope Ministries, or RHM framework. We're dealing with real people, real pain, and real spiritual authority here. So we really need to understand the exact anatomy of an ethical note.
So ask yourself right now, is your documentation actually legally safe? It's really easy to just assume that because our care is pastoral and biblical, secular legal boundaries simply don't apply to us. But think about this. Could your notes be accidentally stepping over crucial legal lines by unintentionally implying that you provided licensed medical care or psychotherapy? The words we choose carry immense weight. A simple slip of the pen can create massive confusion about the actual role you're performing. I absolutely love this quote from the training materials. It says, "A biblical counseling SOAP note should be true, restrained, useful, and anchored in Scripture." This completely reframes how we should be looking at record keeping. We really have to stop viewing documentation as this tedious bureaucratic chore. Instead, it's a profound act of spiritual stewardship. An accurate note protects vulnerable people, it protects you as the counselor, and ultimately it protects the public witness of Christ-centered ministry. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The ethics of record keeping. 2. Safe words and legal scope. 3. Writing biblical SOAP notes. 4. Scripture as documentation anchors. And 5. Protecting the client record. Okay, part 1. The ethics of record keeping. Stewardship, not bureaucracy. As we lay our foundation here, we have to look at the high-stakes theological philosophy behind why we keep records in the first place. Because biblical counselors operate with spiritual authority, we must rigorously pursue truthfulness and public accountability. It's an expression of wisdom before God. Accurate documentation matters because it actively protects vulnerable people from overreach. It maintains role clarity so everyone knows exactly what kind of care is being offered. Plus, it forces us to stay hyper-aware of confidentiality and safety, immediately highlighting when a referral to a licensed professional or emergency service is necessary. Simply put, it's our ethical duty. Moving right along to part 2, safe words and legal scope, specifically navigating Wisconsin law. This is where we make a critical shift regarding legal boundaries. Under Wisconsin law, where RHM operates, language is regulated just as much as actions are. Literally, using words like therapy, treatment, or diagnosis in your ministry notes can unintentionally represent unlicensed professional practice. So the absolute bottom line is that RHM workers must match their title, their consent forms, and their documentation to the actual pastoral role they are performing. We don't pretend to be what we aren't. There's a hard line we cannot cross here. You've got to completely avoid clinical terms like therapist, psychotherapy, diagnosis, or client, unless, of course, you're actually operating under a licensed clinical track. Instead, rely on RHM-approved language. Words like biblical or pastoral counselor, biblical care, presenting concern, and counselee. Highlighting this truthful precision prevents what we call clinical drift. It's what keeps your care firmly and legally within its proper scope. All right, part 3, writing biblical SOAP notes. The same structure, but a different interpretive frame. We use the universally recognized SOAP framework. Now, don't worry, we aren't reinventing the wheel here. We're just translating standard clinical documentation into careful pastoral language. The skeleton of the note is identical to clinical settings, but the interpretive frame totally shifts. S is subjective. This is the counselee's voice and presenting concern, with absolutely zero diagnostic language. O is objective, your observable actions and the specific biblical interventions you used. A is assessment, a synthesis of spiritual themes, progress, and barriers, again, humbly stated without diagnosing. And P is plan, the concrete next steps like homework, scripture reflection, or noting when supervision and referrals are required. Section 4, Scripture as documentation anchors. Let's do a deep dive into the objective section. Now, this is arguably the most crucial part of this entire explainer, so stick with me here. In RHM documentation, you actually can and absolutely should include Bible verses in your notes that you didn't even quote aloud during the session. Why? Because these parentheticals serve as what we call documentation anchors. Their primary purpose is to identify the theological reasoning and the biblical framework that guided your pastoral interventions. They are not meant to be a literal transcript of the conversation. Good. Listen, there is a very strict ethical boundary for how you record this. You must never, ever write your note in a way that implies a verse was quoted aloud to the counselee if it wasn't actually used in that way. Truthful precision means describing your actual action. Saying the counselee was rebellious against James 1:19 when you never even opened the book of James in the room, that's factually incorrect. And honestly, it's spiritually manipulative. Describe your action and anchor it honestly.
We've got to actively avoid what we call proof text decorations. You know, just tossing random Bible verses into the objective section just to make the note look more spiritual. Your citation should prove that your listening, your questioning, or your comforting was a deliberate, scripture-guided care action, rather than just some secular clinical technique.
So, how does this actually look practically? Well, you map your clinical-sounding actions to biblical interventions. For example, let's say your intervention was to practice active listening. You would document your action as attentive listening, careful reflection, and restraint in speech, and you'd anchor it with a reference like James 1:19. Now, you didn't read James 1:19 aloud, but that biblical logic governed your behavior. Similarly, if you summarize a counselee's grief without forcing a quick, premature resolution, you can anchor that with Psalm 113 to show you are using a psalmic, poetic frame, even if you never explicitly opened the book of Psalms during the session. It's a completely honest record of your biblical methodology.
Finally, Part 5, Protecting the Client Record. Let's look at security and storage protocols. Let's close the loop by transitioning from what you write inside the note to the incredibly strict rules about where that note actually lives once you finish typing it. The fundamental rule of data security at RHM is this: Microsoft 365, Word, or OneDrive, those are for temporary staging only. Client information belongs under double lock storage in the official system, which is Theranest. Client data should never, ever be scattered across your personal desktop, left sitting in unstructured Teams chats, or just hanging out in your Downloads folder. No way. We follow an uncompromising 3-step purge workflow. Ready? First, you upload the file to Theranest. Second, you visually verify that it is actually visible in the client's account. And third, you immediately delete the temporary copy from your downloads, the staging folder, and yes, the recycle bin. Remember, the absolute safest duplicate file is the one that no longer exists. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Ask yourself, do your notes protect the counselee, the counselor, the ministry, and the public witness of Christ? Everything we've covered today, from rejecting clinical drift in our vocabulary, to ethically anchoring our actions in scripture without proof texting, to purging those temporary files, it all comes down to personal responsibility. Take profound ownership of your documentation stewardship. Because at the end of the day, how we keep our records is a direct reflection of how we value the people God has entrusted to our care.